Hello, and thanks for considering MyBuilderCPA. My name is Jon Markee, and I am the founder and CEO. I want to spend just a few moments talking about one of our services known as transaction entry. Some people might know this more along the lines of bookkeeping, but we refer to it as transaction entry because there's a lot of elements that can be more tricky than just bookkeeping. So most people underestimate this skill and this service because they think we're just going to get into the bank feed and add all of the transactions from there. But my team knows one of the things I say all the time is the bank feed is a trap. So QuickBooks will often suggest that you add a transaction in a certain way, and it's just simply wrong. It makes a lot of assumptions. Like it might try to guess who the vendor is for the transaction, and it might even pre-populate it, and it just makes it so welcoming to hit that add button in the bank feed. But nothing could be more wrong in a lot of situations. So for example, QuickBooks tries to look at historic trends or patterns and make suggestions that way. And a lot of times we deal with transactions that the only description that comes in from the bank is called deposit. And QuickBooks will make assumptions as to what customer gave you that deposit. And just because it says deposit doesn't mean that it was related to a customer at all. It might have been a drawdown on your line of credit, might be injection of capital from an owner, who knows? So transaction entry takes a lot of training on the back end. I have hours of videos about it, and a lot of times I encourage our team to enter things organically, which means they use the intended menus and functions of QuickBooks Online to enter transactions in a way so that we can match them in the bank feed instead of add them. So let's just take a real quick overview of some of the types of transactions that are available in QuickBooks Online, starting with sales receipt. So that's something that you've received money from a customer and you're depositing it in that same transaction. Then we have an invoice. So that's it goes into your accounts receivable and someone will pay you at a later date. But in the meantime, if we're operating on accrual basis accounting, the software is going to automatically include that as revenue right now. Then we have on the expense side, we have expenses. That is something got paid right now, and we should be able to match it in the bank feed as soon as that transaction posts. Then we have bills, and similar to invoices, that factors into accounts payable. On top of that, we have some more general transactions. So we have transfers, and that can be useful if you're transferring funds from one bank account to the other, maybe from savings to checking or vice versa. Then we have journal entries, which is among the more advanced type of transaction where you really have to know your debits and credits. They have to balance. And in some cases, if you're making entries to AP or AR, QuickBooks also requires a name go along with that. One of our principles here at MyBuilderCPA is making sure that we always attach as much documentation to each transaction whenever possible. So in QuickBooks Online, there's a box for attachments somewhere on the transaction screen. It might be in the bottom left corner, or who knows where they'll move it to next, but it should allow us to attach PDFs, spreadsheets, and then in the memo, sometimes we drop in a link to a specific email or a specific Google Sheet that we've maintained on our end. And we can also link to other transactions within QuickBooks. So something that a lot of our peers underutilize are the memo and the attachment field. So we want to give you as much description as possible. So no matter who comes across this transaction 2 or 3 years down the line, we know exactly what was purchased or why this journal entry exists, all of that. Also, we have to use our professional knowledge to make some assumptions about your business and what you're buying. We oftentimes Google things that we see in the bank description to find more detail about it and hopefully get it booked without you even having to give us input. However, we use a few other apps or integrations that help us get your input, one of them being Uncat. This is an app that has a magic link login, so you shouldn't have to create a username or password. And when we book something to uncategorized income, uncategorized expense, uncategorized asset in your QuickBooks file, you should get an automated email once a week asking for your input. And there's just a description box where you can give us some notes, and you should also be able to upload a file. We also want to utilize some kind of receipt capture tool so that as you're out in the field, if you do buy anything in person, you just snap a picture of that receipt and it goes directly into an inbox where we can process it for you. There's some other documents that we have to routinely collect, such as bank statements, that enables us to reconcile each account after the transactions have been entered. Some of the traps that we find our peers fall into is not clearing uncleared transactions on the bank feed. So whenever we're going through your transaction entry, we're always aware of what uncleared transactions were left over from the last reconciliation, because if something has been on there for an extended amount of time, for example, more than 180 days, chances are the bank is not going to let that transaction go through if it's a check. So that's just one example how we have to use professional judgment above and beyond what just appears in the bank feed. We also have to be intimately familiar with your AR and AP listing as we go through transaction entry, because sometimes the transactions disguise themselves. So whenever possible, we recommend our clients do an individual deposit for each customer payment, because that's more likely to match with something on their account. But sometimes if you don't tell a bank teller that, you walk up to the window, you hand all the checks, and they just deposit it all at once. So in the back of our head, we're thinking, could this deposit be for anything that's sitting in accounts receivable? And vice versa. Say, for example, you rent porta potties and you have 5 of them and you get one monthly bill for each of them. So we have 5 bills in AP, but you submit one payment online. So that one payment covers all 5 of those bills. QuickBooks will not be smart enough to know that breakdown. But if we see the porta potty vendor and we know that there's open AP bills in your QuickBooks, we will make every effort to match them and clear off those old bills. With both AP and AR transactions, there's the risk that revenue or expenses could be double stated if things are stuck in those AP and AR balances. So you could be making decisions about your businesses that are simply wrong just because when you look at your reports, you're seeing the expenses from the bills and then you're seeing expenses from the bank feed where someone simply added the transaction from there. Now, we haven't even started to talk about how this integrates with your job management software. So for our Builder Trend friends, you know that pretty much everything in QuickBooks has to be booked to an item, product, or service in order for it to sync with Builder Trend. And even then, there's 3 points of data that always have to be accurate and mapped between QuickBooks and Builder Trend in order for transactions to sync. That includes the vendor or the customer, item, product, or service, and the I'm drawing a blank. Cost code. So those are the 3 items that always have to be there. And if you've worked with the QuickBooks bank feed for any number of time, you know that you cannot classify items, products, or services from the bank feed. So that basically tears out the entire ability to use the bank feed if you want your Builder Trend file to be accurate. Basically, you always have to enter transactions in Builder Trend first, or you have to enter transactions in QuickBooks organically using the native screens and prompts, and then match transactions to the bank feed. So the service is called transaction entry. Some people think of it as bookkeeping. In reality, especially for those in construction, it's so much more complicated than that. And QuickBooks still underserves us with the way that they guess on these transactions. And anytime we get a new client, we always find transactions that are wrong. And usually it's because they were simply added from the bank feed without any extra critical thinking. Nobody looks at these transactions and pays more than a couple seconds of attention to them, and therefore your QuickBooks file needs some help. But that's okay. That's what we're here for. We want to get you into a good routine where this is predictable. The frequency at which transaction entry occurs is based on your service plan here. So if you want your transactions entered and cleaned up every week, you'll definitely want to be on our Tier 1 Pro Growth plan. If once a month is okay for you, consider the Tier 2 Accelerator or Tier 3 Starter plan. That's what allows us to allocate the time needed to do your transaction entry. Even though you might not see the work that goes into transaction entry, everything that you look at in your QuickBooks or your Buildertrend or other job software is built upon these tedious day-to-day transactions that are the basis of your accounting platform. So don't underestimate the necessity for it to be complete and accurate. If you have any other questions about transaction entry, please don't hesitate to reach out or schedule a meet and greet directly with me.